Part 1. She's a stubborn one, Alejandro, but we have a deal. Tonight, she belongs to you. Mark's voice was a low, conspiratorial murmur, barely audible over the soft jazz, playing in the private dining room. His hand moved smoothly across the polished mahogany table, pushing a pristine white magnetic hotel key card toward the man sitting opposite him. Alejandro, a man whose expensive tailored suit couldn't quite hide the predatory slope of his shoulders, smiled, his teeth flashing like a blade in the dim light. Mark leaned back, chuckling softly, taking a sip of his bourbon. He didn't know I was standing right behind his chair. He didn't know I had just returned from the powder room without making a sound. He didn't know I understood every single word that had just been exchanged. And he certainly didn't expect me to lean down, my lips grazing the shell of his ear, and whisper in perfect Spanish, "I wouldn't bet your life on that, mi amor." But what happened next would change everything. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. 8 months earlier, my life was defined by the sharp, metallic scent of copper and the unrelenting heat of a forward operating base in Colombia. I am Captain Elena Vance, a trauma surgeon with the United States Army Medical Corps. For the past decade, my world had been a theater of calculated chaos. I spent my days inside sterile tents and brightly lit operating rooms, my hands buried in the chests of wounded soldiers, pinching off bleeding arteries and fighting the ticking clock of mortality. In my line of work, you learn to compartmentalize panic. You learn that panic is a luxury that kills people. You learn to assess a catastrophic injury, apply a tourniquet, and calmly execute a procedure to save a life, even when the ground beneath your boots is trembling from artillery fire. In the military, loyalty is not an abstract concept. It is the currency of survival. You trust the person to your left and your right with your life. I foolishly believed that the same rules applied to marriage. I had been married to Mark for 4 years. Mark was a civilian, an aspiring entrepreneur who always seemed to be on the precipice of his big break. He was charming, with an effortless smile and a wardrobe that spoke of wealth he didn't actually possess. When we met, his ambition had seemed intoxicating. He told me he was going to revolutionize logistics software. I believed him. While I was deployed, saving lives and accumulating hazard pay, Mark was back home in our beautiful, sprawling house in the suburbs of Virginia, a house I had purchased outright with the inheritance my late grandfather had left me. My grandfather had been a colonel, a man of iron and grace. He had given me a silver challenge coin on the day I commissioned, a heavy, worn piece of metal that I carried in my left pocket every single day. Whenever I needed strength, my fingers would trace the raised eagle on its surface. It was my anchor. When I returned home from my 9-month deployment in South America, a tour that had required me to become completely fluent in Spanish to coordinate with local military medical units, I expected a sanctuary. Instead, I found a war zone of a different kind. The first breach of my perimeter came in the form of my mother-in-law, Evelyn. Evelyn was a woman whose entire existence revolved around the projection of status. She smelled perpetually of expensive, heavy floral perfume and stale Chardonnay. During my deployment, Mark had moved her into the guest wing of my house, claiming she was dealing with financial restructuring. In reality, Evelyn had squandered her alimony and needed a host to leech off. When I walked through my own front door, hauling my olive drab duffel bags, Evelyn didn't even stand up from the leather sofa. She merely lowered her reading glasses, eyed my exhausted, un-makeup-clad face, and sighed. "Oh, Elena, you're back." I suppose the house will be smelling of combat boots. And bleach again. Mark, darling, make sure the maid uses the good lavender spray. In the foyer. I bit my tongue. I was trained to de-escalate. I unpacked my gear and tried to settle back into domestic life, but the atmosphere in my home felt fundamentally wrong. It felt like walking into a trauma bay and immediately sensing that a patient was internally bleeding, even before the monitors started beeping. The signs were subtle at first. The scent of Tom Ford cologne lingering on Mark's shirts when he came home at 2:00 a.m., claiming he'd been entertaining potential investors. The heavy clinking of Evelyn's jewelry as she paraded around my kitchen, dictating orders to a private chef I didn't know we had hired, using a credit card tied to my primary account. Mark's business is finally taking off, Evelyn told me one evening, swirling her wine glass, the crystal catching the light. He's dealing with international investors now. High net worth individuals. You wouldn't understand, Elena. You just patch up bullet holes. Business is an art. I checked our joint accounts. The hazard pay I had accumulated over 9 grueling months, nearly $80,000, was gone. When I confronted Mark in his study, he didn't apologize. He didn't look ashamed. He poured himself a drink and smiled that easy, practiced smile. Elena, baby, it's seed capital. I had to pivot the company. I found a new backer, a guy named Alejandro. He's huge in import-export out of Miami and Latin America. I just needed to show some liquidity to secure his investment. The returns will be tenfold. You need to trust me. We're a team, right? You took my money without asking, Mark, I said. My voice steady though my heart was hammering against my ribs. That's not being a team. That's theft. He rolled his eyes, his charm dissolving into sneering condescension. Don't be so dramatic. You've been out in the jungle playing G.I. Jane for nearly a year. You don't know how the real world works anymore. I'm building our future. If you can't support that, maybe you need to get your head checked. You've been acting crazy since you got back. PTSD, maybe. The gaslighting was executed with such casual cruelty that it took my breath away. It felt like someone had severed an artery, warm blood pooling silently, where no one could see it. He was using my medical expertise, my service, as a weapon to invalidate my reality. Over the next 2 months, the situation escalated. Evelyn began wearing my clothes, expensive cashmere sweaters I had bought for myself, stretching them out, and leaving them stained with her makeup. When I told her to stop, she cried to Mark, claiming I was emotionally abusing her. Mark demanded I apologize. He refused. The house became a cold, hostile territory. I started sleeping in the downstairs guest room, locking the door behind me. But the fatal wound, the moment my marriage truly bled out, happened on a Tuesday night. If you've ever experienced something like this, a betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect you, leave a like on this video. It was 3:00 a.m. A thunderstorm was raging outside, rain lashing against the windows like gravel. I woke up to get a glass of water. As I passed Mark's office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. He wasn't in there, he was snoring loudly upstairs. But his leather briefcase was on his desk, unbuckled. I don't know what possessed me. Perhaps it was the instinct that had kept me alive in combat zones, the subconscious recognition of a threat. I walked into the office. Underneath a pile of glossy pitch decks, I found a secondary smartphone, a cheap burner phone. I picked it up. It wasn't locked. The glow of my phone screen illuminated the darkroom. My eyes adjusted to the harsh blue light as I opened the messaging app. There was only one contact saved, under the initial I began to read the messages. were entirely in Spanish. Mark, who barely spoke a word of the language, had been using a translation app, copying and pasting the text. I didn't need a translator. The messages detailed a colossal, terrifying financial hole. Mark's business venture was a front. He had been borrowing massive sums of money from Alejandro, who, judging by the terminology used, was clearly operating an illicit lending operation, likely laundering cartel money. Mark owed him over $500,000. But it was the attachments that made the blood freeze in my veins. Mark had sent Alejandro scan documents. I clicked on the PDFs. They were loan agreements, leveraging my ancestral home. The home I owned entirely in my name, as collateral. My signature was perfectly forged at the bottom of every single page. He had stolen my grandfather's house. I kept scrolling, my hands turning to ice. The tone of the messages from Alejandro was growing increasingly violent. He was demanding payment. Mark was begging for more time, explaining that the house was tied up in a trust and he couldn't liquidate it without me knowing. Then came the message from Alejandro sent just 3 hours ago. I am out of patience, Marcos. I am coming to Virginia to collect. However, you showed me a picture of your wife, the beautiful army doctor. I have a weakness. 4 strong women. Bring her to dinner on Friday. Give me one night with her too. Do whatever I please, and I will forgive the interest on your debt for 6 months. If you say no, I take the house and your kneecaps. I stared at the screen, my breath trapped in my throat. Surely my husband, the man who had vowed to protect me, the man I had loved, would refuse. Surely he would go to the police. Surely this was the line he wouldn't cross. I looked at Mark's reply, sent at 1:15 a.m. We have a deal. I'll bring her to Lemoore on Friday. I'll tell her it's a celebration. I'll book a suite upstairs at the hotel next door. The key will be yours. The phone slipped from my hands, landing softly on the Persian rug. For 10 minutes, I stood in the darkness, the thunder crashing outside. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't march upstairs and put a gun to his head, though. My service weapon was locked in the safe, not 10 feet away. In that pitch-black room, surrounded by the scent of Mark's stale cigars and lies, the woman who loved him died completely. Morality died the moment he sold his wife to save his own skin. I reached into my pocket and closed my hand around my grandfather's silver coin. The rough edges bit into my palm, grounding me. I was no longer a wife dealing with a failing marriage. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I had just uncovered a hostile infiltration. It was time to go to war. Part 2. The first rule of tactical warfare is to secure your communications and control the flow of information. I did not confront Mark the next morning. When he came downstairs, yawning and scratching his chest, I poured him a cup of coffee and smiled. It was a flawless performance, forged in the fires of military discipline. Morning, honey, I said, my voice smooth and even. Sleep well. Like a rock, he replied, taking the coffee without a word of thanks. Listen. Keep Friday night open. Alejandro is flying in. We're having dinner at Lemoore. To finalize the paperwork. Dress up. It's important you make a good impression. Of course, I said, turning away so he couldn't see the absolute zero in my eyes. I wouldn't miss it. Over the next 72 hours, I mobilized with military precision. I treated the situation like a mass casualty event, triaging the threats, applying tourniquets to my finances, and preparing the surgical strike that would amputate Mark and Evelyn from my life permanently. First, I called my commanding officer, a stern, no-nonsense colonel who had been a mentor to me. I explained the situation regarding the forged documents and the involvement of an illicit foreign lender. The military does not take kindly to its officers being targeted by criminal syndicates. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in the secure office of a military JAG attorney who quietly introduced me to 2 special agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. When I handed the agents the flash drive containing photographs of Mark's burner phone and the forged deed, their eyes widened. Captain Vance, the lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Miller, said quietly, "We've been trying to build a racketeering and money laundering case against Alejandro Vargas for 3 years. Your husband didn't just borrow money from a loan shark. He engaged in wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy across state lines to facilitate an international crime syndicate. I want my house protected," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "And I want them burned to the ground. We will freeze every asset tied to Mark's name by Friday morning," Agent Miller promised. "As for Friday night, we will be there. We need Vargas to accept that key card. The moment he takes it as payment in exchange for debt forgiveness, it crosses the threshold into human trafficking and extortion. We'll have them both." Second, I needed my silent witness. I needed someone from my bloodline to stand with me when the fallout hit. Someone to witness the truth so Evelyn could never twist the narrative. I called my Aunt Clara. Aunt Clara was a retired trauma nurse, a stoic, fiercely intelligent woman who had practically raised me after my parents passed. She had never liked Mark. When I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, she didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply reached across the table, placed her warm, calloused hand over mine, and said, "What time do we deploy, Elena? Write the word justice in the comments if you are ready for what happens next." Friday evening arrived. The air was thick with humidity, mirroring the suffocating tension in my chest. I wore a stunning emerald green silk dress, my hair pulled back into a sleek chignon. I looked like the perfect, obedient, trophy wife. Mark was practically vibrating with nervous energy, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the mirror. "You look incredible," he said, kissing my cheek. His lips felt like a snake, brushing against my skin. "Tonight is going to change our lives, Elena." "I know it will," I replied. We arrived at L'Amour, an outrageously pretentious French restaurant adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet booths. The maitre d' led us to a private dining room in the back. Evelyn was already there, naturally. Mark had invited her to celebrate his triumph. She was dripping in pearls, sipping a martini, looking at me with her usual thinly veiled disdain. Aunt Clara arrived a moment later, walking with a cane, her face an unreadable mask. Mark frowned. "What is she doing here?" he hissed at me. "Clara is family," I said smoothly. "If tonight is a celebration of our future, she should be here." 10 minutes later, Alejandro Vargas walked in. He was younger than I expected, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, smelling heavily of sandalwood and arrogance. He possessed the dangerous, coiled energy of a predator used to getting his way. He greeted Mark with a firm handshake, ignored Evelyn entirely, and locked his dark, predatory eyes on me. "Captain Vance," Alejandro said, his English heavily accented, but smooth. He took my hand and kissed my knuckles. "Your husband did not exaggerate your beauty." "Thank you, Mr. Vargas," I said, offering a polite, empty smile. Dinner was an agonizing theater of the absurd. Evelyn boasted loudly about Mark's business acumen, entirely oblivious to the dark undercurrents swirling around the table. Mark laughed too loudly, sweating profusely, drinking his bourbon like it was water. Aunt Clara ate her duck confit in total, unnerving silence, her sharp eyes darting between Mark and Alejandro. I played my part, pouring wine, smiling, and waiting. I knew the layout of the room. I knew that the waiter pouring our water was an undercover federal agent. I knew that the couple sitting at the table just outside our glass doors were armed FBI operatives. The net was drawn tight. All I needed was the strike. As dessert was cleared, Mark wiped his forehead with a napkin. Elena, darling, could you go check with the hostess about the vintage champagne I ordered? They seemed to have forgotten it. It was the oldest trick in the book. He needed me out of the room to finalize the transaction. Of course, I said. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and walked out the door. But I didn't go to the hostess stand. I walked 10 paces down the hallway, slipped into the adjacent service corridor, and re-entered the private dining room through the discreet waiter's door hidden behind a velvet curtain right behind Mark's chair. I stood there in the shadows, completely silent. That was when the hook of this story fell into place. Alejandro leaned forward, his voice dropping. The paperwork is signed, Marcos. The debt is suspended, but only if you deliver on the other half of our arrangement. Mark swallowed hard. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pristine, white magnetic hotel key card. He placed it on the polished mahogany table and pushed it slowly toward Alejandro. She's a stubborn one, Alejandro, but we have a deal. Tonight, she belongs to you. Alejandro smiled, his hand reaching out to cover the key card. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain. I leaned down, my face inches from Mark's ear, the scent of his stale sweat and fear filling my nose. I didn't yell. I spoke in a voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. In perfect, flawless Spanish, I whispered, "No apostaría tu vida en eso, mi amo." I wouldn't bet your life on that, my love. Silence filled the room. The absolute, heavy silence of a bomb dropping right before the detonation. Mark whipped his head around, his face draining of all color instantly. He looked like a corpse, his jaw unhinged, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful to witness. Elena. What? You speak Spanish. Fluently, I replied, standing up straight. It was required for my deployment. The deployment where I earned the money you stole to pay off this cartel. Bottom feeder. Everyone turned to look. Evelyn dropped her martini glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, the gin splashing over her. Designer shoes. Mark, what is she talking about? Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking. Alejandro realized the trap a fraction of a second before Mark did. The predator in him recognized the steel in my posture. He snatched his hand back from the key card, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he jumped to his feet, reaching inside his jacket. Federal agents. Nobody move. The glass doors to the private room burst open. Agent Miller and 4 heavily armed FBI agents flooded the space. The undercover waiter dropped his towel, drawing his service weapon and aiming it directly at Alejandro's chest. Hands on the table. Now, Miller barked. The fall of my enemies was a masterpiece of physical collapse. Alejandro, realizing he was outgunned, slowly raised his hands, his face twisting in fury. An agent grabbed him, slamming him against the mahogany table. The cold, heavy click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room like a gavel striking a block. Mark couldn't even stand. His legs gave out. He slid out of his chair, falling to his knees on the floor. His hands were trembling so violently he couldn't even hold them up. Elena, please. He sobbed, his voice high-pitched and pathetic. They made me do it. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to save our house. You forged my signature, Mark, I said, looking down at him as an agent hauled him up by his collar and wrenched his arms behind his back. The metal cuffs bit into his wrists. You stole my grandfather's house. You stole my money. And you tried to sell me to a criminal. The house is safe. The bank accounts are frozen. You have absolutely nothing. You BTCH. Evelyn screamed. The veneer of the high society matriarch shattered completely, revealing the cowardly parasite underneath. She lunged toward me. Her hands curled into claws. Before I could even flinch, Aunt Clara stood up. Despite her cane, she moved. With startling speed, stepping firmly between me and Evelyn. Clara didn't raise her voice. She simply pointed her cane at Evelyn's chest. Take one more step toward my niece, Clara said softly, and I will break your kneecaps myself. Sit down and shut up. Evelyn froze, her face chalk white, and collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands and wailing as the agents read Mark his Miranda rights. I watched as they dragged my husband out of the restaurant. He was crying, dragging his feet, looking back at me with pleading, pathetic eyes. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I just watched him go, feeling the cold, hard weight of the silver challenge coin in my pocket. The aftermath was a swift, brutal execution of justice. Because Alejandro was a high-value target, Mark tried to secure a plea deal by testifying against him. It didn't work. Mark was convicted of wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The judge, disgusted by the details of the hotel key card arrangement, showed zero leniency. Mark was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Evelyn, stripped of her access to my funds and with Mark's assets seized by the government, was evicted from my guest house. The last I heard, she was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of town, working as a receptionist at a tanning salon. 3 months after that night at the restaurant, the divorce was finalized. E kept the house. I kept my money. The story ends not with a grand parade, but with a quiet evening. I stood in the middle of my living room. The house was entirely empty of Mark's belongings, empty of Evelyn's toxic perfume. It smelled only of lemon polish and rain. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the sofa, and pulled the silver coin from my pocket. I stared at the eagle. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I let the tactical shield drop. I cried. I didn't cry for Mark. I didn't shed a single tear for the man in prison. I cried for the illusion I had loved. I cried for the time I had lost. I cried because betrayal from within. Your own camp is a wound that never truly heals perfectly. It always leaves a scar. Aunt Clara walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say a word. She just sat down on the floor next to me, her bad knee popping, and wrapped her arm around my shoulders. I leaned my head against her, listening to the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart. I learned something vital on the battlefield, and I relearned it in my marriage. Blood and marriage rings do not make a family. True family isn't merely the people you are bound to by law or genetics. True family is the people who stand in the trench with you when the artillery starts falling. It's the people who don't run. It's the people who hand you the ammunition when you have to fight for your life. Mark thought I belonged to him. He thought he could trade me. But a soldier doesn't belong to anyone but herself, and her loyalty is reserved only for those brave enough to earn it.